The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. When Brazil's Congress returns, a major agenda item will be the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, who faces accusations that she broke budget law by using accounting tricks to minimize the size of the nation's deficit. This political crisis is tied to a faltering economy in which inflation has edged over 10% and labor markets continue to shed workers. Yet not long ago, Brazil was widely seen as an emerging player on the world stage. To help us understand what's driving the current crisis in Brazil and to look at what might lie ahead, we're joined by Natasha Sugiyama, Associate Professor of Political Science and Interim Director of UWM's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, where her research focuses on public policy and politics in Brazil. And Jessica Rich, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, whose research and teaching also focus on Latin America. Well, welcome both of you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, let's start with an impossible task of Brazilian Politics 101 in a few minutes. So maybe if we use the return of the civilian government as a starting point, just draw that little scope of history for us, if you would, please.
Who wants to take that one? Oh, okay. Brazil's had a tumultuous but yet relatively stable period in its post-constitutional period when they instituted its democracy. Many people mark it as 88 as the year where the democratic constitution went into place. First democratic election in 89. The first president who was elected had a very brief period of 2 years in office because of a corruption scandal. So in many ways, the challenges that Brazil faces with dealing with corruption had a bit of a recurring theme, so to speak, that Brazilian government has had some challenges with. But there have been a number of stable democratic years with the last 4 presidencies or presidential terms really governed by the center-left or center government. It's a complex political system where you have a presidency that is really, elected by the majority of the peoples, but you have a complex congressional setting where you have a lot of parties in Congress. The president rarely has the majority to actually govern without a coalition. So it's thought of as a presidency of coalitional government. And presidents are charged with building that coalition, and it's a tough coalition to get in place, and it's a tough governing task for presidents because they have to deal with over 20 parties in Congress. And you often have to bring together parties that are quite dissimilar ideologically, that may not have a strong ideological position. And the task of governing and building that coalition government is a very challenging one for any president. And it's certainly one of the challenges that Dilma currently faces. So that's a bit of the backstory. We currently have Dilma Rousseff, who's the Workers' Party president. She was preceded by Lula, who had 2 years as well, and then, of course, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the PSDB president, who had been in place for 2 mandates. So 2 mandates from the PSDB, 2 mandates from Lula, and now Dilma's in the second of her 2-mandate period.
And the Lula era was really seen as a bit of a sea change. It certainly was seen with a certain amount of apprehension by capital markets, and people thought this flaming leftist guy is taking the reins. Talk a little bit about his tenure in office.
Well, Lula, was part of the reason it was seen as such a sea change is that he was the opposition candidate for so long. He represented the opposition to government. He represented a real leftist alternative. And so when he finally won the presidency, there was a lot of optimism that his presidency would represent the poor in Brazil, and there was a lot of fear on the part of the financial markets. But he really took great pains to calm the financial markets when he came to power. And for a long while, Brazil's economic boom was seen as partly a result of Lula's taking the presidency.
Mm-hmm. And the poverty reduction agenda really was furthered fairly substantially under his administration, was it not?
It was.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, part of it was that he consolidated a lot of the programs that were smaller but had been in place under the Cardozo government, packaged them within a single program that would be really geared towards the poor who had been excluded from the social welfare network and system that had been in place historically since even the 1930s. So the introduction of the Bolsa Familia program, which is the family grant program, is what it is most well known for, having contributed to lifting millions of Brazilians out of poverty and having elevated the standard of living for many, many millions of people. So the goal under Lula was to address poverty and hunger, and Dilma has made one of her priorities to eradicate extreme poverty and extreme indigency. So that has been one of the kind of flagship social programs of the Lula and then also Dilma presidencies. And part of it is, yes, there's this program in place, but there have also been a lot of other things that have helped contribute to reductions in poverty, like better employment, rising wages. So while as a social policy analyst, I like to talk about how social policy was part of that picture, it wasn't the only picture that was really changing. It was also an economic picture. It was a wage picture that helped contribute to overall well-being. But many people at the bottom really did do much, much better under the PT.
Well, and that economic connection, that sort of macroeconomic dimension of this is largely a function of the nature of the Brazilian economy, isn't it? Talk a little bit about what makes the wheels go around in Brazil economically.
Well, one of the economic problems that Brazil is now facing has to do with Brazil's continued dependence on commodities, exporting commodities in order to make the economy run. Oil, iron ore, soy. Mm-hmm. And Brazil was doing quite well during a period in which commodities prices were high. But now that commodities prices have declined, and now that demand for commodities from China has declined as economic growth has slowed in China, you see the Brazilian economy slowing down, partly as a result of that.
Well, and of course, during those boom years, there was the financial wherewithal for the kinds of social programs we just spoke about. And now when that's no longer the case, it's not an easy thing to sort of lower those expectations, right? Is that part of the problem they're facing right now?
I think it's partly that, but it's also a broader problem. So the program we were just talking about, the family grant program, is actually not that expensive when you look at the whole budget. It accounts for less than 1% of the GDP. It's about half of a percent of the GDP. The biggest social expenditure is pensions. Yeah. And pensions are very expensive for the Brazilian government. And Brazil, compared to other countries, spends far more on pensions, much more generous than other countries in the OECD. In terms of also the minimum age for retirement, it's not uncommon for women to retire at around age 50. Men might retire at around 55, and they're retiring with very sizable pensions. So it's a huge drain on the fiscal accounts, and that is a politically difficult reform for them to have to undertake, and it's a reform that requires buy-in from Congress. So Dilma needs to be able to convince members of Congress to undertake a politically unpopular move. So that's part of the social expenditure piece.
Well, there's a quote here I'd like to read by the Financial Times. It says, Rousseff's ruling Workers' Party, emboldened by the proceeds of the commodities boom, spent much of the past 13 years in power pursuing populist and expansionary fiscal policies, but ignoring what economists say are the wider structural reforms needed for sustainable growth. So is that just sort of Financial Times austerity speak, or is there something to that?
You could talk about, you could argue about whether there's something to that or not, but I think that ignoring the political problem and the inability of Dilma to use different kinds of policy levers to respond to the crisis is a big part of this picture as well. And so that's tied to this debate, but I think ignoring that, I think a broader issue has to do with the way in which she's restricted in responding to the crisis, right? So is this a problem of bad economic policies, or is it an inability of Dilma to respond to this economic recession? It could actually be both at once.
And what are the constraints preventing her from responding?
Well, one of the problems that she faces is that I would say something around 90% of budget cuts need to be approved by Congress. And so what Natasha was saying is that pensions, right, are a major part of Brazilian expenditures. So in order for Dilma to enact budget cuts that are going to make a real difference in the economy, Congress has to approve them. In the current political climate, which is incredibly polarized, you have members of Congress who are opposing any measure that Dilma tries to make in order to bring Brazil out of its economic recession, merely to help kick her out of office.
Right.
So, for example, there was a proposal in Congress to increase the salaries of everybody who worked in the judicial system by 75%. This would cost Brazil billions of dollars, and this was promoted by one of her main enemies in Congress in order to hinder her from solving the economic crisis. So there's a real political problem that's driving this as well, or at least preventing Brazil from climbing out of the current recession.
The lack of confidence in Brazil for a number of reasons, including the Petrobras scandal, is also hindering much of the investment, because they've now been graded by two bonding agencies as essentially having junk bond status. So any kind of foreign investment is going to be certainly diminished under the current climate, because there is so much uncertainty about her political survival, her ability to adjust fiscally, and her ability to garner the political support she needs in Congress to make the kinds of changes that, you know, she might very well want to make, but are challenging in this political climate. Things like adjusting tax law, which are very much relevant and very much part of the conversation, that should be part of the conversation. There have been some unproductive subsidies for industries that haven't yielded the kind of growth in those industries. So eliminating those favorable tax subsidies, essentially, as well as instituting new taxes on financial transactions, which is very unpopular, but is another alternative. But those items are off the table if she can't build enough of a coalition to support her agenda in Congress.
Well, you mentioned Petrobras. We'll talk a bit more about that, and also just the current level of discord that rose to the level of impeachment. But first, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing the Brazilian crisis with Natasha Sugiyama and Jessica Rich. Well, talk a little bit about the Petrobras scandal.
Oh my. Yes, part of it is that the investigation has been unfolding, and every day I read about the Petrobras scandal, and there's more that has been uncovered. But essentially, there are investigations into widespread and huge amount of corruption that has been taking place in Petrobras. Petrobras is the government, public-private, state-owned oil industry. At one point, it was a about 10% of the GDP for Brazil. So it's a huge industry. And there are investigations that suggest that since 2004, Brazilian Petrobras officials colluded with major engineering and construction firms to essentially have a kickback scheme where those cartels would collude to produce bids for major construction, and then they would get kickbacks between the Petrobras officials who were releasing those contracts and the members of the cartel. So in any year, Brazil might be spending $20 million on projects to improve its production. I'm sorry, 20 billion.
Yeah.
20 billion. Sorry, I misspoke because it's hard to believe the amount of money that we're talking about. 20 billion. And there are estimates that anywhere between 1% to 5% of those contracts were part of this massive kickback scheme. So we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar kickback scheme that involved bribes and just a tremendous amount of corrupt practices. And so it's called the Lava Jato, which is a car wash investigation, and it has engulfed a tremendous number of very well-off Brazilians. Major industry companies are included in, as well as politicians. So members of Congress.
When we're talking about members of Congress, we're talking about upwards of 70 members of Congress that have been implicated in this scheme. So this is known as the most major political scandal in Brazilian history, according to some. I mean, I think that's almost consensus.
Yeah.
And this is also put up by some as the root of Brazil's economic problems and the root of Brazil's political problems. It's corruption underlying this, and this has also contributed to the social societal resentment and feelings of disengagement and disillusionment with politics.
And
So
what's the
just
Dilma connection?
So the connection is, so just to give you a sense of these members of Congress who are implicated include the Speaker of the lower house, who is controlling the agenda and is putting forth the argument for impeachment. He has decided he's going to attack Dilma. He is from the PMDB party, which is a member of her coalition government. And her vice president is also of the PMDB. So there is an internal fight within that party about whether or not to support her or whether to leave the coalition. He is on the extreme end of saying he wants to abandon any coalition, and he's going after Dilma and arguing for the impeachment. But he is implicated in the Petrobras corruption scandal, and it's estimated that he got about $40 million worth of the kickbacks from Petrobras. So as the Petrobras investigation has, unfolded, more and more people are implicated. More and more high-ranking politicians are being implicated, and you start to see that all these, machinations in the background are really about, will they be caught up? Will their assets be seized? And will they go to jail? And Dilma has to, as far as I know, suggested that she wants to let the investigation run its course and does not want to interfere and does not want to essentially protect implicated politicians.
Just to extend that a little bit, one of the ways that Dilma's involved in this is that she was Minister of Mines and Energy during a part of this time, and as Minister of Mines and Energy, she was chairwoman of Petrobras, the state-owned oil company that was in the scandal. And so she was actually there to oversee, a lot of Petrobras's operations. She personally is actually not implicated in the scandal.
So far.
Because
we never know, but so far.
But at this point, I think a recent news article is that 4 Brazilian presidents have been implicated, not indicted, but implicated in the scandal, in addition to politicians from all major parties. And so this is problematic for Dilma directly because of her involvement in Petrobras, but it's also problematic for her because as these indictments have come out, it's really angered the opposition, personally politicians who have been implicated, and some people say that that's actually caused them to become so vehemently opposed to Dilma and in favor of efforts to impede her from passing any legislation and to attempt to impeach her.
I'll add that the PT is part of this story too, because the treasurer for the PT has been implicated and indicted. And so there is concern that funds, those kickback funds, went to support PT elections and PT campaigns. So she's just in a pickle, to put it mildly.
So what is the ostensible argument behind impeachment? It's not directly related to the Petrobras scandal.
No, it's not. The argument is that she was not forthcoming with her budget, and that she used resources from state banks to essentially hide a large budget deficit, and that would have taken place in 2014.
And some people say that this is sort of corrupt and against the law, but some people say that this is actually generally accepted practice. And so there's a debate, there's not so much a debate about what happened, but a debate about the legality and how bad this was.
And there's some concern that there's not enough evidence to really justify this kind of action. So it's not even clear that it would go forward. So we'll see. It's partly political will, but it's also the quality of the evidence and whether or not it's even an offense.
Yeah. There's another argument that has to do with campaign financing and irregularities in campaign financing for her elections. And so there are actually several different ways to try to remove her from office happening at once.
So if you could characterize the people pursuing that agenda, the people who want to get rid of her, who would they be, very simply put?
Well, I mean, I think that there's certainly a faction of the PMDB represented by Cunha, who's the House Speaker. I think that there are groups that have been very dissatisfied and have taken to the streets because of the corruption scandal. And then the question becomes, how do you support her ouster if you really wanted her to step down? Would you put enough pressure on her that she would just step down willingly? Would you have to pursue some kind of impeachment action? The desires of parties to engage in that impeachment discussion might vary as the Petrobras scandal unfolds and as they are eyeing their prospects, I think, for the 2018 elections, which are very far away.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of the policy prescriptions going forward. I mean, there's certainly a school of thought, as there often is in Latin America and other regions, that sort of the Washington consensus approach, austerity, diminishing subsidies and all of that. How likely is that? I mean, is there any political possibility of that happening?
Well, I think that in thinking about the opposite of that, trying to increase some counter-cyclical economic measures to come out of the economic recession, Dilma doesn't really have that option at the moment. She can't increase spending because part of the reason for the junk bond rating that Brazil has already received from Standard & Poor is because of spending. And she can't toy with the interest rates. And so what she's been doing has been cutting spending. Her new economic minister that she hired is fairly conservative. And so he is pursuing a strategy of economic orthodoxy, and he has been cutting spending significantly. But the problem in terms of cutting spending is, again, that 90% of the budget has to be passed by Congress in order to be cut. And so even those members of Congress who are seen as more fiscally conservative care more about seeing Dilma fail than they do about cutting spending. And so they're preventing her from passing certain measures to cut spending as well in Congress. So she's really tied in terms of pursuing any type of economic strategy boldly.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, but I'd like to spend that time putting Brazil in the context of the wider Latin American sort of pushback against the sort of pink-tide left-leaning governments that were being elected, it seemed like, up and down the map. And now that seems to be reversing itself. So how does Brazil figure into that? Or does it?
I don't know. I'm not sure how Brazil figures into that, because in this particular case, at the moment, it seems that Brazilians are fed up with corruption. And fed up with politicians who don't represent themselves. I think in part this has to do with an economic recession that is partly a result of a decrease in the price in commodities. And so in that way, Brazil is representative of what's happening in Argentina, in Venezuela as well. But as to what the future political outcome of this will be, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like a lot of countries in Latin America, there was the general feeling that neoliberalism hadn't panned out, that they'd had, the 90s where they did everything that the Washington Consensus asked them to do, but they hadn't seen the benefits in terms of their lives. Healthcare, education wasn't necessarily any better. It was actually probably worse. And there are all sorts of areas where, for the everyday citizen, being part of this neoliberal economic world was not helpful to them.
Well, I'm
And
sorry.
so
We're going to have to leave it at that. Natasha Sugiyama, Jessica Rich, thank you very much. To our viewers, see you next time on International Focus.
Sure. Thanks.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.